Our honeymoon is going to be paid for by that old fool, honey. He won't even suspect a thing." Those words came from my own son Robert's mouth on a Saturday morning, 1 hour before his wedding. And you know what hurt the most? He was laughing when he said it. There I was, in my work clothes with my calloused hands, while he showed off his success to his architect friends. 40 years building half the town in silence, and that night I showed him who really wasn't worth anything. My name is Hank Thompson. I'm 72 years old, and today I'm going to tell you something that forever changed how I see the word family. Because sometimes, son, the people we love most are the ones who disappoint us the most. I had spent 2 years of my entire pension on that Cancun resort reservation. 2 years of waking up at 5 a.m., dealing with difficult bosses, counting every dollar just to save something. And this was what my son really thought of me, a useless old man, a naive old fool who could be easily manipulated. Before I tell you how I managed to teach him the biggest lesson of his life, subscribe and share this story with someone who knows what it's like to be underestimated, because what happened that night changed our family forever. It was Saturday morning, Robert's wedding day in Millbrook, Ohio. I'd been awake since 5:30 a.m., sitting in my kitchen with black coffee, watching dawn break over the small town I'd called home for 7 decades. This wasn't just any Saturday. My only son was getting married. After 37 years of raising him alone since Mary passed, I was finally going to see Robert start his own family. The thought filled me with a pride I hadn't felt in years. Robert had insisted on staying at my house the night before. "It's tradition, Dad," he'd said, though I suspected it was more about saving money on a hotel room. Still, I welcomed the company. The old Victorian house felt too quiet most days, with just me rattling around in rooms that once echoed with family life. Diana, his fiancée, is everything I'd hoped for in a daughter-in-law. She's a dental hygienist at the clinic downtown, hard-working, respectful, with that Midwestern charm that reminded me of Mary. The first time Robert brought her home for Sunday dinner, she'd insisted on helping with dishes and asked genuine questions about my banking career. "You must have so many stories, Mr. Thompson," she'd said, and actually listened to my answers. When Robert finally appeared in the kitchen around 8 a.m., he looked exactly like he had as a teenager. Messy brown hair, wrinkled pajamas, that slightly dazed expression he wore before his first cup of coffee. "Morning, Dad," he mumbled, settling into the same chair he'd occupied during countless childhood breakfasts. I'd already prepared his favorites: scrambled eggs with sharp cheddar, thick-cut bacon, and toast made from the sourdough bread I bake every Wednesday. Call it a father's intuition, but I wanted everything perfect for his big day. "Sleep okay, son?" I asked, sliding the plate in front of him. "Nervous?" Robert shrugged, poking at his eggs. "Yeah, a little. It's a big step, you know." I understood completely. Marriage is terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. I remembered my own wedding nerves, how my hands shook when I slipped Mary's ring on her finger at this very same church we'd be visiting in a few hours. St. Michael's Episcopal had witnessed 3 generations of Thompson weddings, and today would add another. While Robert ate in typical morning silence, I busied myself with final preparations. The photographer would arrive at noon for pre-ceremony shots. The florist had confirmed delivery of white roses and baby's breath to the church. My navy suit hung pressed and ready upstairs, the same one I'd worn to Mary's funeral but had tailored to look more festive. Diana's parents had driven up from Columbus the previous evening, and I'd enjoyed meeting them over dinner at Romano's Italian restaurant. Good people. Her father worked construction, her mother taught elementary school. Salt-of-the-earth folks who'd raised their daughter with solid values.
"Dad," Robert said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence.
"I want you to know how much this means to me, having you there today. And everything you've done. The honeymoon trip, helping with wedding expenses. I know it's a lot." Something in his tone caught my attention. Gratitude, yes, but underneath it was something else. Something that made me look at him more carefully.
"It's my pleasure, son." You're my only child.
I want you to have the best start possible." He nodded, but his eyes didn't quite meet mine. Instead, he focused on his coffee cup, turning it slowly between his hands. "Diana's really excited about Cancun. She's never been anywhere that fancy." "She deserves it," I replied. "You both do." What I didn't mention was that the resort package had cost me nearly $8,000, money I'd been saving for home repairs and maybe a small fishing boat for my retirement. But seeing Robert happy seemed worth any sacrifice. After breakfast, he headed upstairs to shower and start getting ready. I cleared the dishes, wondering why something felt slightly off about our conversation, though I couldn't put my finger on what exactly bothered me. After breakfast, Robert headed upstairs to shower and get ready, and I found myself reflecting on the man he'd become, a successful architect with his own firm, designing commercial buildings throughout Ohio and Pennsylvania, living in a beautiful downtown loft that he'd shown me photos of but never actually invited me to visit. He'd graduated summa cum laude from Ohio State, just like I'd always dreamed he would, and had built what seemed like a perfect life for himself at 37. Diana had been the final piece of his puzzle, an educated, beautiful woman from a good family who shared his ambitions and seemed to genuinely care about him. I could hear the shower running upstairs and imagined him going through his usual morning routine, probably thinking about the vows he'd written, the life he was about to begin, the honeymoon in Cancun that I'd spent months planning and saving for because I wanted to give him something truly special. The resort package I'd booked was beyond anything I'd ever experienced myself, a 5-star beachfront suite with butler service, private dinners on the beach, couple spa treatments, sailing excursions, everything a young couple could want for the most romantic week of their lives. It had taken nearly 2 years of careful budgeting, skipping dinners out, postponing the roof repairs this old house desperately needed, but seeing Robert's face light up when I told him about the gift had made every sacrifice worthwhile. He'd hugged me then, really hugged me, and said, "Dad, you're incredible, I don't know how to thank you." And for a moment I felt like the father I'd always wanted to be, generous, successful, able to provide for my son even in my retirement years. The truth was, I'd been trying to make up for lost time, for all the years after Mary died when I'd been so focused on just keeping us afloat financially that I'd missed baseball games and school plays and father-son camping trips. Working 60-hour weeks at the bank, taking on extra shifts, doing whatever it took to pay for Robert's college tuition and keep him in the lifestyle he'd grown accustomed to, it had all been worth it to see him succeed. Now he was marrying a wonderful woman, his business was thriving, and I could finally relax knowing I'd raised a good man who would take care of his own family the way I'd tried to take care of him. The sound of the shower stopped, and I heard him moving around his old bedroom, probably laying out his wedding suit, the charcoal gray Armani that Diana had helped him pick out and that I'd been happy to pay for because I wanted him to look perfect on his wedding day. In a few hours, we'd be walking into St. Michael's together, and I'd be watching my son promise to love and cherish Diana for the rest of his life, knowing that I'd done everything in my power to prepare him for this moment, to give him the tools and support he needed to be a good husband and hopefully, someday, a good father himself. Around 10 o'clock, I heard Robert talking on the phone in his bedroom, and something about his voice made me pause from organizing the living room where we'd be taking family photos later. His tone was completely different from the subdued, nervous energy he'd shown at breakfast. This voice was animated, confident, almost cocky in a way that seemed strange for a man who'd been picking at his eggs just an hour earlier. I assumed he was talking to his best man Jake about last-minute bachelor party stories or coordinating with the groomsmen about meeting times, but there was something in the rhythm of his speech that caught my attention, a casual arrogance that I didn't recognize. The walls in this old house have always been thin, a quirk of 1920s construction that Mary and I had learned to live with over the years, and while I'd never been the type of father to eavesdrop on my son's conversations, the shift in his demeanor was so dramatic that I found myself unconsciously listening. This wasn't the voice of a nervous groom working through wedding day jitters. This was the voice of someone completely in control, someone who felt very pleased with himself about something. I moved closer to the bottom of the stairs, not with any intention of spying, but because I was genuinely curious about what could have transformed my anxious son into this confident, almost smug person I was hearing. Through all the years I'd raised Robert, especially after Mary died when he was 15, I'd prided myself on maintaining open communication with him, on being the kind of father who knew what was going on in his child's life, who could read his moods and understand his concerns. He'd always been a good kid, maybe a little too comfortable with the nice things I provided, maybe a little too quick to ask for help when money got tight, but I'd attributed that to the adjustment period of young adulthood and my own tendency to be perhaps overly generous because I wanted to make up for the loss of his mother. Over the years, our relationship had settled into a comfortable pattern where Robert would visit every few weeks, usually when he needed something: help with a car payment, assistance with professional expenses, advice about business decisions. But I'd always told myself that this was normal, that grown children naturally turn to their parents for support and guidance. Diana had seemed to bring out a more mature side of him over the past 2 years, encouraging him to be more independent, more thoughtful about his career goals, and I'd been hopeful that marriage would complete his transformation into the responsible adult I'd always known he could become. The wedding itself was a perfect example of how our family had learned to work together. I'd contributed the honeymoon and helped with other major expenses. Robert and Diana had handled the smaller details and personal touches, and her parents had provided the rehearsal dinner and floral arrangements, creating a true collaborative effort that felt like the best kind of modern family cooperation. I'd been particularly touched when Robert had asked me to be not just the father of the groom but also his personal advisor throughout the planning process, calling me with questions about everything from venue selection to menu choices, always saying, "Dad, I really value your opinion on this," or "You have such good taste, what do you think?" These conversations had made me feel truly useful for the first time since retiring from the bank, like my decades of experience in managing people and budgets and complex social situations were finally being appreciated by my son. Standing there at the bottom of the stairs, listening to this unfamiliar confident tone in his voice, I felt a strange unease creeping into my chest. Not quite suspicion, but something close to confusion about why Robert sounded so different when he thought no one was listening. What I heard next changed everything I thought I knew about my son and made me question 37 years of fatherhood in the span of just a few sentences. "No, honey, I'm telling you everything's already arranged," Robert was saying, and I could hear the smugness in his voice even through the old floorboards. The old man already paid for everything: 5-star hotel, meals, tours, spa treatments, the works. We just bought the plane tickets and we're set. There was a pause, presumably while Diana responded, and then Robert laughed. Not the nervous, happy laugh of a groom on his wedding day, but something cold and calculating that I'd never heard from him before. "I swear it's that easy, Diana. Our entire honeymoon is going to be paid for by that old fool and he doesn't suspect a thing. Since I was a kid, I've had this guy figured out completely. I just act like the grateful son, tell him how much I appreciate everything he does, and boom, out comes the wallet without a single question." My legs started trembling so badly that I had to grab the newel post at the bottom of the stairs to keep from collapsing right there in my own hallway. The words "old fool" echoed in my head like a slap across the face, and I felt something fundamental shift inside my chest, something that had been solid and unshakable for decades suddenly cracking like ice on a frozen pond.
What if he feel guilty?
I heard him continue, apparently responding to something Diana had said. Guilty about what? The man lives alone in this big house with nothing but his pension and his memories. He's got no one else to spend money on, so why shouldn't it go to us? Besides, that's what fathers are for, right? To support their kids. He brought this on himself by spoiling me my whole life. Another laugh, even more heartless than the first. "Trust me, baby, he'll never figure it out. When we get back from Cancun, we'll show him all our photos, tell him how amazing everything was, and the poor guy will be so happy thinking he made us happy. It's like taking candy from a baby." Standing there in the hallway of the house where I'd raised this man, where I'd taught him to ride a bike and helped him with algebra homework and held him when he cried after his mother's funeral, I felt the complete destruction of every assumption I'd ever made about our relationship. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or wedding day stress-talking. This was a calculated, long-term strategy that my son had apparently been using to manipulate me for years, maybe decades. "Does it bother me to lie to his face?" Robert continued, and I could practically hear him shrugging. "Look, the man wants to feel useful, wants to feel like the generous father who can still provide for his successful son. If I don't give him that opportunity, he'd probably be depressed. In a way, I'm doing him a favor by letting him think he's helping me out.
The casual cruelty of those words hit me harder than any physical blow he'd ever taken.
Here was my son, the boy I'd sacrificed everything for, the man I'd worked 60-hour weeks to put through college, the person I'd been prouder of than anything else in my entire life, reducing our relationship to a simple con game where I was nothing more than a mark to be manipulated. Every "thanks, Dad" suddenly felt hollow. Every "I really appreciate this" became suspect. Every moment of what I'd thought was genuine affection now seemed like carefully calculated performance designed to keep the money flowing. "He's actually kind of pathetic when you think about it," Robert said, and that word, pathetic, cut through me like a knife. Sitting in this old house, waiting for me to visit, getting so excited when I asked for his advice about stuff. Sometimes I think he'd give me his last dollar if I asked for it, and he'd feel honored to do it. I stood there holding on to that banister, feeling like everything I'd believed about love and family and sacrifice was dissolving around me, replaced by the terrible understanding that I'd been played for a fool by the person I loved most in the world. The conversation I was overhearing forced me to confront a devastating truth about the past 2 decades of my life, and suddenly every interaction with Robert began to make horrible sense in a way I'd been too blind or too loving to see before. "I mean, come on," Robert continued, his voice carrying that same casual cruelty. The guy worked at First National Bank for 42 years, started as a teller and worked his way up to regional manager, so you'd think he'd be smart about money and people, but when it comes to me, he's like putty in my hands. What Robert didn't understand, what he'd apparently never bothered to learn despite all those years of watching me work, was that you don't survive 4 decades in banking without developing a keen sense for when someone is trying to play you, without learning to read between the lines of every sob story and emergency request that comes across your desk. I'd handled thousands of loan applications, dealt with countless people trying to manipulate the system, caught fraudsters and con artists who thought they could outsmart the system, but somehow I'd been completely blind to the fact that my own son had been running the longest con of all. "Remember that time his transmission went out and he needed $3,000 immediately?" Robert was saying, and I remembered that incident clearly. It was 2 years ago, and Robert had called me in tears, saying his car had broken down on the highway and the mechanic was telling him it would cost more to fix than the car was worth. "I didn't even have transmission problems," Robert laughed. "I wanted to upgrade to a newer car but didn't want to deal with financing, so I figured why not let Dad take care of it? He was so worried about me being stranded that he had the money in my account within an hour." The memory hit me like a physical blow because I remembered exactly how panicked I'd felt that day, imagining my son stuck on some dangerous highway, vulnerable and helpless, and I'd rushed to the bank during my lunch break to wire him the money without hesitation. "And the best part," Robert continued, "was how grateful I acted when I picked up the new car. I drove it over to his house, let him think I'd found some amazing deal at a used car lot, and he was so proud of me for being responsible with money. Every supposed emergency, every crisis that had required my immediate financial intervention, every time I'd congratulated myself on being the kind of father who could provide for his adult son when life threw him a curveball, it was all fabricated, all carefully orchestrated theater designed to separate me from my money while making me feel good about it. The man gave me $15,000 for what he thought was graduate school," Robert said, and I felt my knees nearly buckle because I remembered that conversation vividly. Robert had come to me with brochures for an advanced architecture program, talking about how it would advance his career, how the degree would open doors to bigger projects and better clients. And I'd been so proud that he was thinking about his future that I'd written the check immediately. "I never enrolled in any program," Robert laughed. "I used the money for a down payment on my loft and let him think I was studying every weekend when I was actually just living my life." The systematic nature of his deception was staggering, and what made it even worse was the realization that he wasn't just stealing my money. He was stealing my emotions, my pride, my sense of being a useful and loving father. Every time I'd felt that warm glow of satisfaction from helping my son through a difficult time, every moment I'd congratulated myself on raising a young man who trusted me enough to come to me when he was in trouble, every instance when I'd felt valuable and needed, It had all been an illusion carefully crafted by someone who saw me not as a father but as a resource to be exploited. "The honeymoon thing was genius," Robert was saying. "I told him Diana had always dreamed of going somewhere tropical, that it would mean the world to her to have a real romantic getaway, and you should have seen his face light up. He was practically falling over himself to book the most expensive package he could find." Standing there in my own hallway, listening to my son mock the very generosity I'd thought was my greatest strength as a father, I felt something fundamental die inside me. Not love, because despite everything I still loved him, but respect, trust, and most importantly, the willingness to be anyone's fool ever again. As I stood there processing the magnitude of Robert's betrayal, my mind began working with the analytical precision that had served me well during 4 decades of banking, and I started seeing patterns that I'd been willfully blind to for years. The way Robert's emergencies always seemed to happen right before I received my pension check. How his visits became more frequent whenever I mentioned having extra money from a certificate of deposit maturing. The subtle way he'd gauge my financial situation before launching into whatever sob story he'd prepared for that particular visit. "You know what's really funny?" Robert was saying to Diana, and I could hear him moving around his room, probably pacing while he talked. "Sometimes he actually thanks me for letting him help me out. Like when I told him I needed money for that business conference in Chicago, which was actually just me and Jake going to a Cubs game. He said he was honored that I trusted him enough to ask for assistance with my career development." The conference story hit me particularly hard because I remembered feeling so proud that Robert valued my business advice enough to seek my financial support for professional growth, and I'd spent weeks afterward asking him about the sessions he'd attended and the networking contacts he'd made, never questioning why he seemed so vague about the details. "I've basically trained him to think that giving me money makes him a good father," Robert continued with that same casual cruelty. "He gets this look on his face when I thank him, like he's just accomplished something really meaningful, and I swear sometimes I think he'd be disappointed if I stopped asking for help because then he wouldn't feel needed anymore." The psychological manipulation was even more sophisticated than I'd initially realized. Robert hadn't just been stealing my money, he'd been carefully managing my emotions to ensure I'd continue enabling his lifestyle while feeling good about it, creating a feedback loop where my generosity reinforced his sense of entitlement and my own need to feel valuable as a father. "The beauty of the whole system," Robert was explaining, "is that he never questions anything because he wants so badly to believe that I'm still the perfect son he raised, that all his sacrifices paid off, that he succeeded as a single father after Mom died." That reference to Mary, to the years I'd struggled to be both mother and father to a grieving 15-year-old, felt like a knife twisting in my chest because those had been the hardest years of my life, working extra shifts to afford grief counseling for Robert while dealing with my own devastating loss, and apparently he'd learned nothing from watching me struggle except how to exploit my vulnerabilities. I realized that my banking experience had actually prepared me perfectly for this moment. I'd seen countless financial predators over the years, people who identified vulnerable targets and systematically extracted money from them through emotional manipulation, and the techniques Robert had been using were textbook examples of elder financial abuse, except that instead of being victimized by a stranger, I'd been conned by my own son for the better part of 2 decades. "The old man probably thinks this conversation is about wedding nerves," Robert laughed, apparently responding to something Diana had said. "He has no idea that I'm actually celebrating the biggest score of my career, a week in Cancun that cost him $8,000 and didn't cost me a dime. $8,000. He'd gotten the exact figure right, which meant he'd been paying more attention to my finances than I'd realized, probably calculating just how much he could extract without completely bankrupting me, managing me like a renewable resource that needed to be harvested carefully to ensure long-term sustainability. The cold-blooded nature of his planning was breathtaking, and I found myself almost admiring the skill with which he'd played me, except that the victim of his con game was his own father who'd loved him unconditionally since the day he was born. "Anyway, I should probably go downstairs and act grateful for a few more minutes," Robert said. "Got to keep up appearances until we're safely on that plane tomorrow morning." But as I heard his footsteps approaching the bedroom door, I was already formulating my own plan, because if there's one thing you learn in banking, it's that the best way to stop a con artist is to cut off their access to money, and Robert was about to discover that this old fool still had a few tricks up his sleeve. The sound of Robert's bedroom door opening snapped me back to the immediate reality of what I needed to do, and as I heard his footsteps on the stairs, I quickly moved away from my listening post and settled into my recliner, picking up the newspaper with hands that were still trembling from rage and shock, forcing my face into an expression of calm normalcy that felt like the greatest acting performance of my life. "Hey, Dad," Robert said as he entered the living room, and I looked up to see him wearing his casual wedding day outfit, khakis, and a button-down shirt that I'd bought him for Christmas, with that same relaxed, confident demeanor I'd been hearing in his voice upstairs, completely unaware that his entire future had just changed in the span of a 10-minute phone conversation. "Just checking some wedding details with Diana," he said, settling onto the couch across from me with that easy smile that I now realized was probably as fake as everything else about our relationship. "She's getting her hair done right now, totally stressed about whether the flowers will match her dress. You know how women are about these things." The casual sexism in that comment, combined with everything else I'd just learned about his character, made me want to grab him by the shoulders and shake him until his teeth rattled, but instead I just nodded and made some appropriate father-of-the-groom comment about wedding day nerves while my mind raced through the practical steps I needed to take to teach him the lesson he so desperately deserved. "Actually, Dad," Robert continued, leaning forward with an expression that I'd seen countless times before but now recognized as his manipulation face, "I wanted to thank you again for everything you've done for us, especially the honeymoon gift. Diana keeps saying she can't believe how generous you are, and honestly, I sometimes can't believe how lucky I am to have a father who would spend that kind of money on us." The words were perfectly chosen, exactly the kind of gratitude that would normally make me feel proud and valued, but hearing them now after his phone conversation felt like being slapped with a velvet glove, and I had to grip the arms of my chair to keep from lunging across the room at him. "It's my pleasure, son," I managed to say, proud that my voice sounded steady and normal. "I want you and Diana to have the best possible start to your marriage." "We will, Dad, thanks to you," Robert replied, and then he actually had the audacity to get up and give me a hug, wrapping his arms around me in what felt like a parody of filial affection while I sat there rigid with fury, calculating exactly how much satisfaction I was going to get from watching his face when he realized that his old fool of a father had been listening to every word of his conversation. "I know I don't say it enough," Robert continued, still holding on to me in that fake embrace, "but you really are the best father anyone could ask for. I hope someday I can be half the man you are." Those words, which should have been the greatest compliment a father could receive, instead felt like the final insult in a lifetime of being taken for granted, and as Robert finally released me and headed back upstairs to continue getting ready, I sat there in my chair feeling something cold and hard crystallize in my chest where warm paternal love used to live. The transformation was immediate and complete. One moment I was Hank Thompson, the devoted father who would do anything for his son, and the next moment I was Hank Thompson, the retired bank manager who had just identified a problem that needed to be solved with precision and efficiency. I waited until I heard Robert's bedroom door close again before I got up and walked to the kitchen phone, pulling out my address book and turning to the page where I'd written all the confirmation numbers for the Cancun trip, every restaurant reservation, every spa appointment, every excursion I'd booked with such care and excitement just weeks before. My hands were steady now, my mind clear and focused in a way it hadn't been for years, because after 4 decades of dealing with people who thought they could outsmart the system, I knew exactly how to shut down a con artist, and Robert was about to learn that his old fool of a father had just graduated from mark to adversary. The first call I made was to the Presidente Intercontinental Cancun, and as I dialed the number I'd memorized from weeks of planning, I felt a strange calm settling over me, the same methodical focus I'd used during my banking career when dealing with difficult situations that required both precision and emotional detachment.
"Good morning, Mr. Thompson, the reservations agent Said when identified myself."
"How can I assist you with your upcoming stay?" "I need to cancel my reservation," I said simply, and there was a pause on the other end as the agent pulled up my file. "Sir, I see here that you have the presidential suite booked for 7 nights, all meals included, spa packages, and several excursion bookings. This is quite an extensive reservation. May I ask the reason for cancellation?" "There's been a change in circumstances," I replied, proud of how steady my voice sounded. "I understand, sir, but I must inform you that with less than 24 hours' notice, our cancellation policy means there will be no refund available. We're talking about a significant amount of money here." "I'm fully aware of the financial implications," I told him. "Please proceed with the cancellation." As I hung up that first call, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of taking decisive action instead of simply reacting to whatever crisis Robert had manufactured, and I immediately dialed the number for Cancun Adventures to cancel the Sunset Catamaran cruise, the private snorkeling excursion, and the romantic beach dinner that I'd so carefully arranged because I wanted Diana to have the fairy tale honeymoon she deserved. "Mr. Thompson, are you absolutely certain about this?" the booking agent asked. "These are some of our most popular experiences, and your son specifically mentioned how excited his fiancée was about the Sunset Cruise." "My son says a lot of things," I replied, and proceeded to cancel every single activity I'd booked, from the couple's massage at the spa to the private tour of Chichen Itza with a bilingual guide who specialized in Mayan history. With each cancellation, I felt layers of foolishness and naivety peeling away, replaced by a growing sense of my own power and dignity that I'd forgotten I possessed during all those years of being manipulated by someone who was supposed to love and respect me. The hardest call was to Rosa's Romantic Dining, the beachfront restaurant where I'd arranged for Robert and Diana to have 3 special dinners, complete with mariachi serenades and champagne toasts, because the woman who answered the phone sounded genuinely disappointed when I explained that the young couple wouldn't be coming after all. "Senor Thompson, we have prepared everything so beautifully for them," she said in accented English. "The table with the ocean view, the flowers, the special menu. Are you certain there is no way to work this out?" "I'm certain," I told her, though her obvious care for creating a perfect romantic experience made me feel momentarily guilty about involving innocent third parties in my lesson for Robert. But then I remembered his voice saying, "Old fool," and "pathetic," and my resolve strengthened as I continued down my list, methodically dismantling the week-long fantasy I'd spent months creating and thousands of dollars funding. The final call was to American Airlines, where I discovered that Robert and Diana's tickets were non-refundable, which meant they could still fly to Cancun if they chose, but they'd arrive to find absolutely nothing waiting for them except whatever budget accommodations they could afford with their own money. "Is there anything else I can help you with today, Mr. Thompson?" the airline representative asked, and I almost laughed at the question because yes, there was definitely something else. I was about to attend my son's wedding with the knowledge that in less than 18 hours he would be standing in a hotel lobby in Mexico, finally learning what it felt like when the safety net he'd taken for granted his entire adult life suddenly disappeared. By the time I finished the last call, it was nearly noon and I could hear Robert moving around upstairs, probably putting on his wedding suit and checking his appearance in the mirror, completely unaware that his honeymoon had just evaporated and his father had just reclaimed his dignity. I walked to my bedroom and began getting dressed for the ceremony, choosing my navy suit and silver tie with the same care I'd once put into preparing for important business meetings, because today wasn't just about watching my son get married. It was about watching him take the first step toward learning that actions have consequences, and that the old fool he'd been manipulating for decades had just reminded him who really held the power in their relationship. Walking into St. Michael's Episcopal Church that afternoon felt like entering a completely different world than the one I'd inhabited just a few hours earlier, and as I took my seat in the front pew reserved for the father of the groom, I found myself studying every detail of the ceremony with the detached analytical mind of someone who now understood that appearances could be devastatingly deceptive. The church looked magnificent. Diana's family had spared no expense on the floral arrangements, with white roses and baby's breath creating elegant displays along every pew, and the afternoon sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows cast everything in a warm, golden glow that should have made this one of the happiest moments of my life. Instead, I sat there watching my son adjust his tie nervously at the altar, looking every inch the devoted groom who was about to pledge his life to the woman he loved, and all I could think about was how perfectly he'd mastered the art of looking like something he wasn't. When Diana appeared at the back of the church in her simple but elegant white dress, the entire congregation stood and turned to watch her walk down the aisle, and I had to admit she looked absolutely radiant, glowing with the kind of genuine happiness that only comes from believing you're about to marry the man of your dreams. The contrast between her obvious joy and my growing cynicism about Robert's capacity for genuine emotion created a knot in my stomach, because I realized that Diana was about to promise her life to someone she didn't really know, just as I'd been loving and supporting someone who'd turned out to be completely different from who I thought he was. "Dearly beloved," Father Williams began, "we are gathered here today to witness the joining of Robert and Diana in holy matrimony, a sacred bond built on love, trust, and mutual respect." And I almost choked on the word trust, because it felt like a cruel joke given what I'd learned about my son's true character just hours earlier. Throughout the ceremony, I watched Robert recite his vows with what appeared to be heartfelt sincerity, promising to love, honor, and cherish Diana for the rest of his life, to be faithful and honest and supportive through whatever challenges they might face together. And I found myself wondering if he actually believed what he was saying or if this was just another performance. Another carefully crafted manipulation designed to get what he wanted. "I promise to be your partner in all things," Robert said, looking directly into Diana's eyes with an expression of such apparent devotion that even I, knowing what I now knew about him, almost believed he meant it. "I promise to support your dreams, to respect your independence, to be honest with you always, and to love you more each day than I did the day before." The word honest hit me like a physical blow, and I had to grip the edge of the pew to keep my composure as I realized that Robert was capable of standing before God, his bride, and a church full of witnesses and making solemn promises about honesty while simultaneously running the most elaborate con game I'd ever encountered. When Father Williams pronounced them husband and wife and Robert kissed Diana while the congregation erupted in applause, I clapped along with everyone else, but my hands felt mechanical and empty, going through the motions of celebration while my heart remained completely disconnected from the joy surrounding me. During the reception at the Millbrook Country Club, I watched Robert work the room like the charming, successful architect everyone believed him to be, accepting congratulations and backslaps from his friends, dancing with Diana like a man completely in love, giving a speech about how grateful he was to have found his soulmate and how excited he was to start their life together with a romantic honeymoon in Mexico. "I want to especially thank my father," Robert said during that speech, raising his champagne glass in my direction while the entire room turned to look at me, "for being the most generous, loving man I know, and for making it possible for Diana and I to start our marriage with the trip of a lifetime." The applause that followed felt like mockery, and I raised my own glass and smiled and nodded like the proud father everyone expected me to be, all while counting down the hours until Robert would be standing in a hotel lobby in Cancun, finally learning what it felt like when the person you trusted most in the world revealed that they weren't who you thought they were. The wedding reception ended around 11 that night, and as the last guests filtered out of the country club, I watched Robert and Diana climb into the decorated sedan that would take them to Robert's downtown loft for their first night as husband and wife, both of them glowing with the kind of exhausted happiness that comes from a perfect wedding day, completely unaware that their fairy tale honeymoon was now nothing more than 2 plane tickets to a destination where they'd find themselves stranded without reservations, without the luxury accommodations they were expecting, and without the safety net that Robert had spent his entire adult life taking for granted. "Dad," Robert called out through the car window as they prepared to leave, "we'll see you at 6:30 tomorrow morning for breakfast before our flight. I can't wait to tell you all about the trip when we get back." I waved and smiled and called back something appropriately father-like about having a wonderful time, all while knowing that in less than 12 hours, Robert would be learning the most expensive lesson of his life about the difference between being loved and being used. During the drive home to my empty house, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness that I couldn't quite reconcile. Satisfaction because I'd finally taken decisive action to reclaim my dignity, but sadness because the son I thought I'd raised apparently didn't exist, replaced by a calculating manipulator who saw me as nothing more than a convenient ATM with emotional attachments. I spent that night lying awake in the bed I'd shared with Mary for so many years, staring at the ceiling and thinking about all the signs I'd missed, all the red flags I'd ignored because I wanted so desperately to believe that I'd succeeded as a single father, that the sacrifices I'd made after Mary's death had produced a son who would make us both proud. Around 3 in the morning, I got up and made coffee, sitting at the kitchen table where Robert and I had shared our last breakfast as father and son with a normal relationship, and I found myself wondering if I was doing the right thing or if I was just a bitter old man taking revenge on someone whose only crime was being too comfortable with his father's generosity. But then I remembered his voice saying "old fool" and "pathetic," and I realized that what I was doing wasn't revenge. It was education, the kind of tough love that I should have administered years ago when Robert first started treating me like his personal banker instead of his father. At exactly 6:30 the next morning, my phone rang, and when I saw Robert's name on the caller ID, my heart started pounding because I knew this was the moment when everything I'd set in motion would finally come to fruition. "Morning, Dad." Robert's voice sounded cheerful and energetic, completely unsuspecting. "We're just leaving the apartment now. Should be at your place in 15 minutes for breakfast." "I'll be ready," I told him, and I was ready to sit across from my son one last time while he maintained his performance of being the grateful, loving child, ready to smile and nod while he thanked me again for my generosity, ready to send him off to Mexico with hugs and well wishes, knowing that by afternoon he'd be calling me from Cancun with panic in his voice, finally understanding that his old fool of a father wasn't nearly as stupid as he'd assumed. When they arrived, Diana looked absolutely radiant in her traveling outfit, chattering excitedly about the resort amenities she'd researched online, the excursions she was looking forward to, the romantic dinners she and Robert had planned, and I sat there listening to her innocent enthusiasm while Robert nodded along, probably mentally calculating how much money he'd saved by letting his sucker of a father pay for everything. Over pancakes and coffee, Robert continued his act of being the appreciative son, telling me how much the trip meant to them, how grateful they were for my support, how this was going to be the perfect start to their marriage, and with every word he spoke, I felt more confident that I'd made the right decision. Because someone who could lie so effortlessly to the person who loved him most deserved to learn what happened when that person finally stopped believing the lies. I was sitting in my living room reading the Sunday paper when my phone rang at exactly 2:47 p.m., and when I saw the international number from Mexico on my caller ID, I felt my heart rate increase not from anxiety but from anticipation, because I knew this was the moment when Robert would finally understand that his carefully constructed world of manipulation and entitlement was about to collapse around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. "Dad." Robert's voice sounded confused and shaky when I answered, completely different from the confident, cocky tone I'd overheard the day before. "Dad, we're at the hotel in Cancun, but there's some kind of problem with our reservation."
What kind of problem, son?
I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral while internally savoring every second of his confusion. "They're saying there's no reservation under our name, that everything was cancelled yesterday," Robert continued, and I could hear Diana's voice in the background asking what was happening. "That's impossible," I said, feigning surprise. "I made those reservations months ago and confirmed them just last week." That's what I told them, but the manager is saying that someone called yesterday afternoon and cancelled everything. The suite, the meal plans, the spa appointments, all of it. Robert's voice was rising with panic now. "Dad, they're saying there's no refund because it was cancelled with less than 24 hours' notice." I let the silence stretch for a long moment, listening to the sound of my son's breathing getting more rapid as the reality of his situation began to sink in, and then I said the words I'd been rehearsing in my mind since yesterday afternoon. "Robert, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." "What, Dad? What do you need to ask?" "Do you really think I didn't hear what you said yesterday morning when you were talking to Diana on the phone?" The silence that followed was so complete that I thought the call might have dropped, but then I heard Robert's sharp intake of breath and I knew that he understood exactly what I was talking about. "Dad, I don't know what you mean," he said, but his voice had changed completely, becoming small and defensive in a way I hadn't heard since he was a child caught in a lie. "Our honeymoon is going to be paid for by that old fool, honey. He won't even suspect a thing," I quoted back to him, word for word.
Ring any bells, Robert?
"Dad, please, I can explain," Robert said, and now his voice was breaking with what sounded like genuine panic. "You can explain how you've been manipulating me for years, calling me names behind my back, treating me like your personal ATM while pretending to be a loving son?" I asked, and I could hear Diana demanding to know what was going on, her voice sharp with confusion and growing alarm. "You can explain how every emergency, every crisis, every time you needed money was just another con game designed to separate me from my pension?" "It wasn't like that, Dad," Robert protested, but even he seemed to realize how hollow his words sounded. "It was exactly like that, and you know it," I replied.
You called me pathetic, Robert.
"You said I was an old fool who could be easily manipulated. You laughed about how simple it was to get money out of me." I heard Diana's voice more clearly now, demanding that Robert tell her what I was talking about, and then I heard him trying to explain in whispered, urgent tones while I waited patiently for him to finish his damage control.
Mr. Thompson.
Diana's voice came on the line, and she sounded like she was crying. "Is it true what Robert just told me? Did he really say those things about you?" "I'm afraid it is true, Diana," I said gently, because she was an innocent victim in all of this.
He heard every word.
"But why would you cancel our honeymoon?" she asked. "Why would you punish both of us for something Robert said?" "Because actions have consequences, Diana, and your husband needed to learn that the person he's been taking advantage of for years isn't the pushover he thought I was," I explained. "And because sometimes the only way to teach someone respect is to stop enabling their disrespectful behavior." When Robert came back on the line, his voice was completely different. Gone was any pretense of confidence or control, replaced by the sound of someone who had just realized that their safety net had disappeared and they were falling fast. "Dad, please, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," he said. "I know what I said was terrible, but please don't do this to us. We don't have money for another hotel. We spent everything on the wedding and the plane tickets." "Then I suggest you figure out what you're going to do next," I told him, "because this old fool just taught you the most expensive lesson of your life." The phone call that followed my revelation lasted over an hour, and during that conversation I watched my son's entire worldview crumble in real time as he tried desperately to convince both Diana and me that he could change, that he'd learned his lesson, that this was all just a terrible mistake that could somehow be undone if we could just find a way to restore the reservations and pretend this confrontation had never happened. "Dad, please, I'm begging you," Robert said at one point, his voice breaking with what sounded like genuine desperation. "I know I screwed up, I know what I said was unforgivable, but Diana doesn't deserve to suffer for my mistakes." I could hear them talking in hushed, urgent tones between our exchanges, and when Diana came back on the line, her voice had changed completely from the happy, excited newlywed I'd spoken to that morning. "Mr. Thompson," she said, and I could tell she'd been crying, "Robert told me everything, about the things he said, about how he's been asking you for money all these years, about how he's been lying to both of us. Diana, I want you to know that none of this is your fault," I told her, because despite my anger at Robert, I genuinely cared about this young woman who'd been dragged into a situation she never could have anticipated. "You're a good person who deserves better than being manipulated by someone who should love and protect you." "But what are we supposed to do now?" she asked. "We spent our savings on the wedding and the plane tickets, and we can't afford to stay at any of the nice hotels here. Robert is talking about just flying home tomorrow, but we used our vacation time from work and we can't get it back." The practical reality of their situation was exactly what I'd intended. Robert was finally experiencing what it felt like to have his plans disrupted by someone else's decisions, to find himself in a difficult situation without a safety net, to face consequences for his actions without being able to charm or manipulate his way out of trouble. "There are budget hotels in Cancun," I suggested. "You could still have a honeymoon, just not the luxury vacation that Robert was planning to enjoy at my expense." "That's what I told him," Diana replied, "but he's so upset about this whole situation that he doesn't want to do anything. He keeps saying he's humiliated, that he can't believe you heard him say those things, that he doesn't know how to face you when we get home." When Robert took the phone back, he sounded like a completely different person than the confident manipulator I'd overheard the day before. "Dad, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but please tell me there's some way we can work this out," he said.
He'll pay you back every penny you lost on the cancellations. He'll never ask you for money again. He'll do whatever you want me to do."
"Robert," I said carefully, "the money isn't the real issue here. The issue is that for years you've been lying to me, using me, making me feel like a fool while pretending to love and respect me." "I do love and respect you," he protested. "Then why did you call me an old fool? Why did you say I was pathetic? Why did you laugh about how easy it was to manipulate me?" The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Robert was finally understanding that words have consequences, that relationships built on deception eventually collapse, and that the person he'd been taking advantage of wasn't going to enable his behavior anymore. "We found a small hotel about 20 minutes from the beach," Diana said when she took the phone again. "It's not fancy, but it's clean and we can afford 3 nights. After that, we'll probably just come home." "I think that's a wise decision," I told her. "And Diana, I hope you'll remember this experience when you're thinking about your future with Robert. A man who can lie so easily to his father might find it just as easy to lie to his wife." By the time we hung up, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because I'd finally stood up for myself and taught Robert a lesson he desperately needed to learn, but sadness because the relationship I'd thought we had was apparently just an illusion that had taken me decades to see through. The son I'd raised with such love and sacrifice had turned out to be someone I barely recognized, and while I hoped this experience might shock him into becoming a better person, I knew that some fundamental trust between us had been broken and might never be fully repaired. 3 days later, when Robert and Diana returned from their abbreviated honeymoon in Cancun, I received a phone call that confirmed everything I'd suspected about how the trip had gone, and Robert's voice carried a humility I hadn't heard since he was a small child who'd been caught doing something he knew was wrong. "Dad, we're back," he said simply. "Could Diana and I come over to talk to you? I know I don't have any right to ask for your time after what happened, but there are some things I need to say to you in person." When they arrived at my house that evening, I could see immediately that the experience had changed both of them. Robert looked like he'd aged 5 years in 3 days, his usual confident swagger replaced by the nervous energy of someone who'd been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about himself, while Diana seemed more mature, more serious, like she'd seen a side of her new husband that she was still trying to process. "Dad," Robert began as soon as they sat down in my living room, "I need to tell you how the trip really went, because I think you deserve to know what your lesson actually accomplished." They'd spent their first night in Cancun sleeping in the airport because every hotel they could afford was completely booked, finally finding a small family-run motel about an hour from the beach where the air conditioning barely worked and the shower produced only cold water. "We had to buy our meals at convenience stores because we couldn't afford the resort restaurants," Diana added quietly. "And when other couples asked us about our honeymoon plans, we had to lie because we were embarrassed to admit we were staying at a place that charged $30 a night." But the real revelation came when Robert described what had happened on their second day, when they tried to salvage something from the trip by visiting some of the local attractions, only to discover that even the budget tours were beyond their limited remaining funds. "We were sitting on this bench outside a gift shop, trying to figure out if we had enough money left for bus fare back to our motel, and Diana asked me a question that I couldn't answer," Robert said, his voice breaking slightly. "She asked me when was the last time I'd done something nice for you, Dad, something that cost me my own money, my own time, my own effort, instead of just taking whatever you offered me." The question had apparently triggered a conversation between them that lasted most of the night, during which Diana had pressed Robert to really examine his relationship with me, to think about specific examples of when he'd shown genuine care for my well-being rather than just gratitude for my financial support. "I couldn't come up with a single example from the past 5 years, Robert admitted, staring at his hands. "Every visit, every phone call, every interaction we'd had was somehow connected to something I needed or wanted from you. Even when I brought Diana over for dinner, I was usually hoping you'd offer to pay for something, our anniversary dinner, or help with rent, or car insurance." Diana's perspective on the situation had been particularly illuminating, because she'd started connecting Robert's behavior toward me with patterns she'd noticed in their relationship. The way he expected her to pay for most of their dates because he was saving money, how he'd convinced her that expensive engagement ring she'd wanted was just materialistic nonsense, while secretly planning to ask me to fund their honeymoon, the subtle ways he'd trained her to have lower expectations so he could appear more generous with minimal effort. I realized that if he could manipulate his own father so completely, someone who loved him unconditionally, Then he could definitely manipulate me, Diana said, and I could see the pain in her eyes as she spoke. It made me question everything I thought I knew about our relationship. The most devastating moment had come when Robert tried to call some of his friends for emergency money to extend their stay, only to discover that several of them had suspected for years that he was taking advantage of me, and they'd finally decided to stop enabling his behavior by refusing to bail him out of a situation that was entirely of his own making. Jake told me that he'd been wanting to say something for a long time about how I treated you, but he didn't think it was his place, Robert said. He said it was obvious to everyone except me that you deserved better than a son who only showed up when he needed something. By the time they'd returned to Ohio, Robert had been forced to confront the reality that he'd built his entire adult life around the assumption that I would always be there to catch him when he fell, and now that safety net was gone, he was finally seeing himself clearly for the first time in decades. What happened over the following months surprised me more than anything that had occurred during the entire ordeal, because Robert didn't just apologize and then gradually slip back into his old patterns of behavior. Instead, he seemed to undergo a fundamental transformation that affected every aspect of how he approached our relationship and his life in general. The first sign that something had genuinely changed came 2 weeks after their return from Cancun, when Robert called me on a Tuesday evening just to ask how I was feeling, whether I needed help with anything around the house, and if I wanted company for dinner that weekend. The first time in years that he'd initiated contact without needing something from me. "Dad, I know this might sound strange coming from me," he said during that call, "but I've been thinking about how lonely you must be in that big house, and I realized that I've been so focused on my own life that I never really considered what yours was like after we stopped having regular contact." When he and Diana came over that first Saturday, I watched carefully for signs that this was just another performance, another manipulation designed to get back into my good graces so he could resume his old patterns, but instead I saw something I'd never witnessed before: genuine interest in my well-being, real curiosity about my daily routine, actual concern about whether I was taking care of myself properly. Diana had clearly played a significant role in his transformation, not by nagging or criticizing him, but by asking pointed questions that forced him to examine his behavior from perspectives he'd never considered before. She asked me to imagine how I'd feel if our future children treated me the way I've been treating you, Robert explained during one of our conversations. She made me realize that I wasn't just hurting you, I was setting an example for the next generation about how family relationships should work. The most convincing evidence of his change came when his car genuinely broke down 3 months later, requiring a repair that cost nearly $1,500, and instead of calling me for help, he took out a small personal loan from his bank and worked overtime for 2 months to pay it off. "It was the first time in my adult life that I handled a financial crisis without involving you," he told me when he finally mentioned the situation, weeks after he'd already resolved it. "And you know what? It felt incredible to solve my own problem, to not owe anyone anything, to prove to myself that I could handle adversity without running to Daddy for money." Diana had insisted that they start coming to visit me every Sunday, not for dinner or any special occasion, but just to spend time together as a family, and during these visits I began to see glimpses of the man I'd always hoped Robert could become, someone who asked thoughtful questions about my experiences, who remembered details from previous conversations, who actually listened when I talked instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. "I want to learn how to be a good son," he told me one afternoon as we worked together in my garden, planting tomatoes and peppers for the spring season. "I know it sounds ridiculous for a 37-year-old man to say that, but I honestly don't think I ever learned how to have a relationship with you that wasn't based on what you could do for me." The change wasn't just in his behavior toward me. Diana told me privately that Robert had also started taking more responsibility in their marriage, contributing equally to household expenses, planning dates that he paid for himself, and showing appreciation for her in ways that didn't cost money but required genuine thought and effort. "It's like I married a different person," she confided during one of our conversations. "He's still the man I fell in love with, but now he's also someone I can respect as an equal partner instead of someone I have to take care of like a child." 6 months after the Cancun incident, Robert did something that completely stunned me. He presented me with a detailed spreadsheet showing every dollar he'd asked me for over the past 5 years, along with a payment plan for how he intended to pay it all back. "I know you probably don't expect this," he said as he handed me the document, "but I need to do this for my own self-respect. I can't move forward as the man I want to be while I still owe you money that I took under false pretenses." The total amount was staggering, over $30,000 in various emergencies and opportunities that I'd funded without question. But what impressed me most wasn't the money, it was the fact that Robert had taken the time to research and document every transaction, showing a level of accountability and attention to detail that I'd never seen from him before. 2 years have passed since that wedding day when I overheard my son's true feelings about me, and I can honestly say that canceling Robert's honeymoon was the best decision I ever made as a father, not because it was easy or pleasant, but because it finally forced both of us to confront the unhealthy dynamic that had been poisoning our relationship for decades and gave us the opportunity to rebuild it on a foundation of genuine respect rather than manipulation and enablement. Robert has kept his word about paying me back. Every month without fail, he deposits money into my account along with a detailed note explaining what the payment covers, and he's currently about halfway through his repayment plan, but more importantly, he's become the kind of man I always hoped he could be. Someone who takes responsibility for his actions, who values family relationships for more than what he can get out of them, and who understands that love and respect are earned through behavior, not just claimed through words. Diana and I have developed a wonderful relationship over these past 2 years, and she often tells me that the Cancun incident, as difficult as it was at the time, actually saved their marriage by forcing Robert to confront his character flaws before they had children and before his patterns of manipulation became too entrenched to change. "I learned something important that week," she told me recently. "I learned that sometimes the people who love us most have to hurt us in order to help us grow. And I learned that Robert needed a father who would hold him accountable, not one who would just keep enabling his worst impulses." The most rewarding part of this entire experience has been watching Robert discover what it feels like to be genuinely proud of himself, to solve his own problems, to contribute to relationships instead of just taking from them, and to earn respect through his actions rather than expecting it because of his status as my son. Last month, when I had a minor medical scare and needed someone to drive me to doctor's appointments, Robert immediately rearranged his work schedule to help me, not because I asked him to, but because he wanted to, and the gratitude I felt wasn't for the rides to the doctor, but for finally having a son who would show up for me the same way I'd always shown up for him. "Dad," he said to me after one of those appointments, "I know I can never make up for all the years I wasted being a selfish, ungrateful person, but I want you to know that you teaching me that lesson in Cancun was the best thing that ever happened to me, even though it was also the most humiliating experience of my life. The truth is, I learned something important too during this whole ordeal. I learned that sometimes loving someone means refusing to make their life easier, that true generosity involves teaching people to stand on their own rather than carrying them indefinitely, and that the difference between helping and enabling can be the difference between raising a responsible adult and creating a permanent dependent. I learned that respect cannot be bought with money or gifts, that family relationships require mutual consideration and effort from both sides, and that setting boundaries, even when it hurts, is often the most loving thing you can do for someone you care about. Most importantly, I learned that it's never too late to demand better treatment from the people in your life, even if those people are your own children, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to stop protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. My relationship with Robert today is stronger, more honest, and more fulfilling than it has been since he was a child, not because I gave him everything he wanted, but because I finally had the courage to give him what he needed, a lesson in accountability, a wake-up call about respect, and the opportunity to become the man I always knew he could be. If this story reminded you to never judge by appearances and to remember that sometimes tough love is the most important kind of love, leave me a comment telling me about your own experience with family relationships that needed to be reset. Don't forget to subscribe because this old grandpa has many more life lessons to share, and remember that it's never too late to teach respect, and it's never too late to demand the dignity that every parent deserves from their children.